Right, sorry, I've just been reading the chat and the introductions from people. Great skills, great knowledge. Thank you everyone for being here today and welcome. We are very excited. I think our third collaborator, Hajar Gorbani, cannot be here this morning, but I might be able to speak on her behalf, saying how excited we all three are, Stacey, Hajar, and myself, to be hosting these webinars. This is the third and last one of the small series of webinars launching this book, which has been a fantastic journey for us. And I've realized the other day it was quite brief, in fact. It didn't take as long as they usually do, but I think it's a testament to how committed all the contributors have been and how well they worked with us in the process and how well the publisher supported us in this initiative. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Panagiotis Pentaris. I'm a thanatologist based in England, in the UK, and based at the University of London, Goldsmiths, where I run the Thanatology Research Lab. And I've been really lucky to have had the opportunity to work with a number of contributors in this book, primarily with my two co-editors that have been wonderful teachers for me throughout this journey. And we're here today to look at the third segment that we're presenting in the launch, which is on mapping deathways and looking at environmentally, digitally, and via repatriation, the different deathways in this world. And I should say a few words about our book. Which I'll go off script here, but this book began from many conversations over time, which perhaps are underpinned by principles we all share here, which is that we recognize how the conversation, research, theory, practice around death, grief, and bereavement continue to be rather surrounded by some dominant discourses, some dominant disciplines, some dominant voices. And we miss out on the brilliancy of the work and the knowledge that could be imparted from other parts of the world, other different voices, different practices, more creative methodologies as well that come to complement what we already know or add something very new. And it was very important for us to try and navigate that. And we were very happy that so many individuals showed such an interest and wanted to be part of this book. So just want to say a big thank you to everyone who took part. There are four particular sections in this book. I don't know how many of you have received your copies yet, but get out there and get your copy. And we would be happy to hear from you what you thought of it and whether we need to be continuing this moving forwards. There is an exploration in this book of a very wide range of different perspectives, and it covers areas to do with rituals, it covers areas to do with representations, with necropolitical discourses and biopolitical understandings of the management of death and grief. There's a lot of different discourses around myths and communities as well in this volume. So, so what I would say is that it's perhaps it adds a little bit to the conversation about how our understanding about death, grief, and bereavement could evolve and become more complete rather than linear. So we're looking at more cyclical ways of understanding these experiences. And as I said, this is the third and last one of three webinars we run. We're very excited about the other two as well, as we are about today. The main thing I want to say here were two main things. A very special thanks to the Association for Death and Society that has been endorsing and supporting this endeavor and has been becoming a little bit of a host of these webinars. And I should say that at the end of today, as we have done with the other two webinars, we are running a raffle, which is a randomized selection of one of the attendees here who will be receiving a copy of the book for free from the publisher and the editors. So we will be announcing the winner of that raffle at the end of today. Okay, I think that's enough from me. We do have three wonderful speakers here today who have contributed to this volume. Pardon. We have Dr. Tamara Borovica, who has contributed a piece of work around the Anthropocene and the climate emergencies and loss and eco-grief. We've got Dr. George Gumisiriza, and George has contributed something around grief, a migrant die, a death, and repatriations. And we do have also Dr. Lionel Obadia, who will talk to us a little bit more about digital decolonization of death and the deadbots. So I don't want to take too much of our time because I want our speakers to have that privilege and then yourselves so that we can have a discussion at the end. A couple of logistics before I start inviting the speakers in. We have time until just another hour and 15 minutes ahead of us, an hour and 17 minutes to be precise. We will offer about 15 minutes to each of our speakers to go through their presentation. They will talk to us about their work, their thesis. And then at the end, we will open it up to questions as well as a discussion. I would encourage people in the course of the presentations that they could be dropping their questions into the chat. I know sometimes we forget what it is that we heard about 45 minutes ago. And Stacey and I will be monitoring that in the background as well. I will, at this point, then come back to the room. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'll come back to the room. And I will start by inviting our first speaker, who is Dr. Kamara. Sorry, apologies, Dr. Tamara. See, I'm already losing my words. Dr. Tamara Borovica, who is the Vice Chancellor's postdoctoral research fellow at the RMIT University, and will be talking with us about climate emergency and eco-grief and loss. So, Tamara, whenever you are ready, you can share your screen. Fantastic. And please do better justice to yourself by introducing who you are as well to our audiences. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Panagiotis. That was perfect. It's a real pleasure to be here with you all tonight. I'm calling in from Melbourne, Australia, so it's just past 7 p.m. for us dialing in from the Southern Hemisphere. It's my great pleasure to be talking to everyone in the Zoom room today, and my special thanks to the editors and contributors for putting such an important collection together. I want to say that it's been a great honor for my colleagues and I to be invited to contribute to the book Decolonizing Death Studies, especially because it's a book that invites us to rethink what death studies is, what it has taken for granted, and what it might yet become. I don't feel like I need to say much more about myself. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow exploring emotion, mental health, and resilience, and grief is one of the topics that we have come across a lot in our research over the last couple of years, and especially in relation to environmental degradation, climate emergency, and a loss of species in Australia and globally. So before I start with my presentation, let me just see if I can move. Okay. I would like to acknowledge the country in which this work has been conducted. I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of Boiwurrung and Boiwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation, on whose unceded lands we conduct our business at RMIT University. This is also a land on which I live and work, and I express my gratitude through traditional owners who kept it preserved for such a long time. So the chapter, my dear colleagues, Katrin Gerber and Larissa Hjorth, who I think is with us in the room tonight, and I contributed to this book titled Grief at the End of the Anthropocene, Climate Emergency, Loss, and Eco-Grief, asks what it might mean to think about ecological loss, climate grief, and planetary distress through the broader project of decolonizing death studies. At one level, the chapter begins from something that is now widely felt, that the climate crisis is not only an environmental crisis or a scientific crisis, or even only a political crisis. It is also a crisis of loss, a crisis of damaged relations, disappearing species, transformed landscapes, broken continuities, and foreclosed futures. It is increasingly becoming a mental health crisis too. Across many contexts, people are grieving what is being lost through climate and ecological breakdown. They are grieving places, seasons, species, attachments, memories, and imagined futures. Yet, these forms of grief remain difficult to name, and they remain unevenly recognized. What interests us in writing this chapter was not only the growing visibility of terms like eco-grief, ecological grief, climate grief, but also the question of how these forms of grief might challenge the boundaries of death studies itself. Because if death studies have often been organized around human death, human mourning, and human bereavement, then ecological grief asks us to pause and ask, what counts as loss? Who or what is grievable? What forms of relation are being mourned? And whose grief has historically been recognized and whose grief has been ignored? These are essentially decolonial questions, and some of them we borrow in our thinking from Judith Butler's early work on grief and grievability. A key argument of our chapter is that eco-grief should not be understood simply as an individual psychological response to environmental change. It is not just sadness about nature, nor it is only an internal state. Rather, eco-grief is also social, embodied, relational, and political. It emerges through attachments to place, to human and more than human worlds, and to ways of living that are being eroded or destroyed. And importantly, ecological loss is not experienced equally. This is where the decolonial framing of the volume becomes essential. Climate crisis and ecological loss are inseparable from colonial histories, extractive violence, racialized inequality, and the ongoing dispossession of indigenous land and ways of living. For many communities, the mourning of damaged land, broken kinship relations, and ecological destruction is not new. It has long been part of colonial experience. So one of the things the chapter tries to do is resist any easy or universal language of eco-grief. Instead, it asks how grief is shaped by power, by histories of colonization, by uneven vulnerability, and by very different cultural relations to land, death, and more than human life. In this sense, eco-grief becomes a way of exposing the limits of dominant Western frameworks of mourning, and it asks us to move beyond a narrow understanding of grief as private, individual, and ultimately, at some point, hopefully resolved. It asks us instead to think of grief as something that can be ongoing, collective, and politically revealing. The chapter draws on interview materials from a broader 4-year ethnographic and creative practice project led by my dear colleague Larissa Hjorth, where we explored grief, mourning, and mobile media. Across the larger study, we interviewed over 100 participants with professional, sometimes or personal experience of grief. For this chapter, we focused on interviews with 4 climate researchers and educators based at Australian universities, whose reflections help illuminate how grief is being articulated in relation to climate and ecological crisis. These interviews are important because they show how eco-grief is being articulated from within spaces often associated with rationality and objectivity. From the 4 interviews, 4 themes emerged. emotional legitimacy and the transformation of scientific discourse, grief as a catalyst for collective witnessing, eco-grief as a critique of colonial environmental narratives, and youth despair and the limits of resilience discourse. What we found striking in these conversations was the way grief disrupted familiar distinctions between knowledge and feeling, science and emotion, detachment and care. Our participants described grief not as something outside knowledge, but as part of what it means to witness climate and environmental change and to live ethically within it. In the chapter, we trace several connected themes. The first is, like I just said, growing legitimacy of emotion within climate discourse. Grief, despair, and vulnerability are increasingly surfacing in spaces that have historically privileged objectivity and emotional restraint. That matters because it suggests that grief is not simply a failure of resilience or professionalism. It may also be a form of knowledge, a way of registering what is being lost and what forms of violence have become normalized. The second is grief as a form of collective witnessing. Grief can gather people around loss, not in order to resolve it quickly, but in order to stay with it, make it visible, and recognize its social and ethical significance. The third theme is that eco-grief can function as a critique of colonial environmental narratives. It unsettles romantic ideas of untouched nature and instead directs attention to damaged relations, responsibilities, and actually long histories of dispossession. And the fourth theme is the place of young people within this landscape of loss. Young people are often living most intensely with the environmental consequences of ecological crisis, including anxiety, grief, dread, and anger. The current generation of young people is the first one to live their entire lives under the condition of climate and ecological emergency. Yet their response is frequently individualized or pathologized, rather than understood as a meaningful reaction to structural and planetary conditions. This is especially important because climate grief is often discussed alongside the language of resilience. And while resilience can sometimes be useful, the chapter also points to its limits. If resilience becomes a demand that young people simply cope with worsening conditions, then it risks obscuring the broader systems that produce distress in the first place. So one of the broader interventions of this chapter is to suggest that grief should not always be read as something to overcome or something to be cured. Grief may as well be a mode of ethical attention paying, a way of staying with a loss, a refusal of indifference, and perhaps even a precondition for imagining different futures. For us, this is where the chapter connects most strongly to the wider ambition of the Decolonizing Dead Studies collection. To decolonize dead studies is not only to diversify its object of study, it is also to question its underlying assumptions about whose lives matter, whose losses count, what forms of death are visible, and what relations between life, death, land, and community are rendered intelligible. Eco-grief and climate grief press on each of these questions. They ask dead studies to reckon with more than human loss. They ask us to attend to colonial and extractive histories. And they ask us to think about grief not only as an aftermath, but as a deeply relational and political condition of the present. So I want to end by saying that what we value most about this collection is that it does not simply add new case studies to an existing field. It asks the field to change. It asks what that studies might look like if it began not from universality, but from situated histories, plural ontologies, unequal violences, and different modes of relation. Our chapter is one small contribution to that larger conversation, and its central claim is this. At the end of the Anthropocene, grief is not only a response to environmental loss, it is also a way of exposing the colonial and relational conditions of that loss, and perhaps a way of learning how to live more accountably with each other and with the more than human world. Thank you so much. I will.
Thank you, Tamara, so much. This was wonderful, and you
Hope
can
I
see
was
on the
fitting within the.
screen you did perfect, and you can see on the screen all the hearts and the applause. It's one of the things we're missing out on from being in a room together is that lively
Yes,
energy.
connectedness. Yeah, yeah.
But thank you. This was wonderful, and what great questions. Your contribution and your the progression of your thinking as well within this theme is raising. So we will come to questions and comments at the end, though. So for now, I think I'm gonna move us along to our next speaker. I will remind the audience that you're very welcome to start posting questions and comments on the chat. We're going to be collecting them and then we're going to address them at the end, though. So, with that in mind, I will go ahead and invite our second speaker, Dr. George Gumisiriza. George, I know I'm mispronouncing your last name again. I think for all the years I've known you, I've not been able to do it right, but I keep telling myself that that's okay because my last name has never been pronounced well either. So, I don't, George, where are you? Am I seeing you? There you are. Okay, so George, our lovely George, who advances a little bit of the Afrocentric understandings of death through the work that he's done on the concepts of repatriation scapes and migrant death work across the borders. And I'm going to leave it to George to talk to us about his work, his wonderful contribution to this volume and to our field of death studies. So, George, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Panagiotis. Are you able to hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, very well.
And can you see my slides?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, let me see. Um, Here, share. Screen.
It's coming
Ah,
up slowly. There you are.
okay.
Yep.
All right.
Perfect. Over to you.
Okay. Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. You're most welcome. My name has been pronounced well after quite a while. So I can't let you get away with that. Yes. I've just finished my PhD and I'm trying to find my academic home. By default, I'm a sociologist and looking at what I say, I think I'm a cultural sociologist. So any cultural sociologist, wherever you are, you can reclaim me. I'm here for, grabs. And then the geographers, I'm not very far from you. And of course, anthropologists, I belong there. Yes, so I'm still there. I'm job hunting. Those who have got jobs, grab me as well. So here we are. I'll start by saying thank you to the three editors, the wonderful editors who have not only been mentors to so many people I've talked to, but they've been able to see me as someone who has got potential or someone who has got a burden, who has been campaigning to bring Afrocentric perspectives of death, dragging them from the margins to the center. So thank you so much, the three of you. I also want to thank all of you who have encouraged me in one way or another, and here we are. First, I looked at the title of this session. I wanted to readjust it and add something, but I couldn't because it was watertight, including everything I've ever imagined, I've ever thought of, and I've done, both in academia, in class, and in life, in the process and in practice. And I was like, wow. So my mind was well captured in there, and I took it the way it is. And I think it's fine. So I will stick to my script because I tend to talk too much. Um, Mapping deathways environmentally, digitally, and through repatriationscapes. The, I beg your pardon, I had something.
It
Okay,
was
I'll
an
continue.
accident. Yeah.
It was an accident. Okay. The title of this section captures the book's central concerns by drawing on a biopolitical and techno-ecological orientation of the relationship between life, death, power, and the body. My contribution extends this discussion by foregrounding cultural, diasporic, and transnational politics of death, particularly as they emerge in context of migration and ancestral belonging. As a Ugandan-born British African scholar, I position my work at the intersection of death studies, migration, cultural theory, and social policy. My research foregrounds how death is lived, negotiated, and resisted across borders and histories, especially within African and diasporic contexts. It is against this background that I selected the chapter title, A Migrant Dies in Egypt, Jacob's Spectacular Repatriation to His Family Tomb, anchored in Repatriationscape Studies. My presentation focuses on the following. 1. The decolonizing factor through Repatriationscape spectacle. 2. Reflections on mapping deathways. 3. Ancestral burial spaces and belonging, changing burial models among African peoples, with examples from Uganda and Congo, and a conclusion. The decolonizing factor through Repatriationscape spectacle. A. Meaning of Repatriationscapes. Repatriationscapes, my original term, captures the transnational and intersectional labor that surrounds death, ritual care, and practices of resistance. The operations within these repatriationscapes embody what I describe as crisscrossing death work, the layered, often improvised, and relational forms of care, coordination, and cultural stewardship that unfold across borders. In the context of this session, Repatriationscapes denotes the multidimensional spaces of interaction through which diverse communities, including African diasporic groups and their transnational affiliations, navigate death, belonging, and mobility. The term encompasses a range of migratory, end-of-life contexts involving not only the deceased, but also the individuals whose death is imminent and who return home, in quotes, as a final act of affiliation and emplacement. As presented in this book, and grounded in Afrocentric cosmologies and personal lived realities, Repatriationscapes maps the emotional, spatial, and ethical terrain where mourning becomes movement and memory becomes method. The ritual process unfolds through singular elements embedded within the repatriationscape. Conceptualizing repatriationscapes, process and practice. Layers of the repatriationscapes. First ring, place of heritage connections. We have the birthplace, marital home, ancestral land, spiritual resting site. The ring visualizes the multiplicity of home, in quote, as dynamic, negotiated, and fluid. Second ring, cultural and ritual meaning. We've got the rites of passage there. For example, we've also got Ubuntu or Ubuntu ethics. There are material practices such as the shredding material, backcloth, transport rituals, coffins and casket, flowers, and the rest of that. This layer reflects metaphysical, ethical, and emotional logistics of repatriation. The third ring, migration and borders, national policies, bureaucratic hurdles, visas, transport, embalming protocol. This depicts structural barriers that state involvement where necropolitics operates. These are spaces of migrantization. The outer ring, global forces and historical legacies. We've got the colonial history in all its diverse presentations, for example, the British Protectorate. We've got the post-colonial displacement, who have diaspora grief networks. And this frames repatriation within long histories of movement, exile, and return. Reflections on mapping deathways. Dying, death, and the dead unsettle systems of order, certainty, and modernist control because they introduce the unruly materiality of the body into frameworks that prefer abstraction, progress, and coherence. They expose the limits of both modern and postmodern thought. Modernity attempts to sequester death as an external anomaly, while postmodernism struggles with the brute fact of the corpse, which resists rhetorical play and continually intrudes into the symbolic life of the living. Across cultures, the dead remain active within social, symbolic, and referential systems, challenging the idea that death is a singular event rather than an extended process. This is evident in the ways rituals, cosmologies, and cultural narratives keep the dead present, and in how different societies resist the Western gaze that often exoticizes or misrepresents non-Western practices, prompting communities to assert their own meanings and differences. The example of Jacob's narrative presented in chapter 13 of our book demonstrates how the dead can occupy the same ontological and material space as the living, collapsing distinctions between life and afterlife and refusing the notion that symbolic meaning-making ends at biological death. A central initiative in decolonizing death studies, this book attempts to identify both where key physical and symbolic positions and how policy and practice nuances, similarities and differences unfold in contemporary death scholarship. These dynamics have not been ignored by earlier scholars, but have often been overlooked or under-examined in academic work. In his foreword, Fontaine just reminds us that, quote, there are only multiple ways of knowing that overlap, coexist in contested jostlings, jumblings, and assemblages that are never stable, always imagined, and always full of potentiality, end quote. For me, Fontaine's submission aligns with the purposive ambiguity inherent in describing deathways. The term deathways is a more expansive term that includes death scenes, corpse preparation, burial practices, funerals, mourning, and commemoration. From this perspective, the contributions in this publication are timely, often offering an expanded understanding through diverse articulations of deathways. For example, diasporic communities negotiate identity, home, and return, especially when bodies are cross borders after death. This includes the moral, emotional, and logistical labor of ensuring the dead go home, and the ancestral politics that shape decisions around burial, memorialization, and belonging. The conceptual framework of Repatriationscapes compels us to think about the more than human connections. Another central theme in decolonizing male death studies explored through this publication. Ancestral burial spaces and belonging. On the left, that is a picture of my village in 1981. The notable details are the banana grove that you can see around here, the snow-capped Mount Rwenzori barely holding on the snow, that is Mount Rwenzori, and the green landscape, it's all green. I mean green, green. The colonial explorers saw that and called it the Mountains of the Moon. Whereby, for us, we called it Rwenzura. Rwenzura it means it's a mountain of rain. And they gave it the highest peak as Mount Margarita and other peaks, including Mount Stanley and Mount Baker. I'm not so sure whether my mother knows this. So reports indicate that all snow is melting. And in the last decades, people in the region have continuously experienced excessive flooding and landslide. In fact, the landslides are so common here. And then on my right, that is my family burial grounds. And the notable features is this is an avocado tree. That is another avocado tree. These are yams. At the background there, we've got a tea plantation, the tea that we drink in tea bags. That's what the green leaf looks like. But this whole area, wherever you see a green plant like that, is a mark of a grave. So I know almost everyone who has been buried here. And more recently, there is that one, which we are going to talk about. So this is a glimpse into my family ancestral burial space, which holds my heritage connection in Uganda. We buried our dead in the banana grove. The banana trees, the avocado tree, and the tea plantation absorbed and recycled the bodies, allowing the dead to become part of the landscape. By eating the produce of this land, we blended the living and the ancestral dead, sustaining a relationship of continuity and reciprocity. Ghanaian-born scholar George Day frames this as, quote, the traditional African value of humanness and harmony with nature, end quote. Day's vision of being human includes wholeness, compassion, hospitality, and generosity. Within the broader context of Decolonizing Death Studies campaign, harmony with nature refers to burial practices that respect the environment and acknowledge the interconnectedness of life and death. This is also my family graves, my family burial ground. This was particularly opened in 1990s when we had HIV/AIDS. It was at its peak and we lost so many people. And two of these were repatriated from the UK. So you know everybody here. There are many other graves, but you can see the banana grove that we were talking about earlier. It's being cleared, it's being extended, and graves are being put here. These two, his husband and wife, my uncle and my auntie, they died from COVID. And you can see that the banana grove, the bananas are struggling against the grave. So, in the neo-colonial era of the 21st century, dominant discourses on poverty and development continue to enforce capitalist logistics, shaping social expectations and accelerating shifts toward modernity. These pressures are clearly visible in contemporary grave transformations from across African contexts. In Uganda, For example, a modern grave like this often involves digging a hole, lining it with concrete, tailing it, placing the coffin or casket inside without soil, and sealing it with iron bars and an iron sheet and a final layer of concrete. My research revealed that similar burial models are now widespread across several African countries, signaling the increasing commercialization and materiality of funerals.
And I quickly, George, just say I'm enjoying this so much, first of all. We're just about at 17 minutes or so. So if you want to work towards wrapping it up in the next 2 minutes, that'd be great, just to give enough time for discussion at the end. Yeah?
That's it. That's true. And this is what it is. I'm the last one. Okay. So these two graves, this grave is from Congo. I got it from a scholar in Cambridge. This change in burial models disrupts the African value of humanness and harmony with nature described earlier. The dead are confined in perpetual oblivion, severed from the ecological cycles that once sustained ancestral continuity. Findings further show that repatriated corpses from the UK to Africa and countries are frequently buried in these modern grave structures, except in cases where religious traditions such as Islamic practices prohibit such forms. The broader narrative of coloniality in Africa helps us explain these shifts. Burial models are changing, landscapes are being reshaped, and the dead are increasingly curtailed from forms of ecological immortality that once connected them to land, kin, and ancestral belonging. Conclusion. This Decolonizing Death Studies publication illuminates how mortals pursue a place of reality in dying, death, and for the dead. Across the chapters, we see that this pursuit becomes possible when the dying retain agency over the terms of their own death, and when, after death, survivors enact the will of the deceased or seek to honor a life through cultural, meaningful rites. Throughout the volume, the corpse emerges not as a neutral biological object, but as a site of power administratively produced through policy, classification, and burial regimes, culturally curated through ritual narrative and cosmology, and politically shaped through racial hierarchies, belonging, and exclusion. My own chapter on death of the migrant Jacob in Egypt exemplifies these dynamics. His story reveals how political power blurs boundaries between migrant and native, unsettling assumptions that belonging, legitimacy, and right to be mourned. Yet the spectacular repatriation generates new tensions that resonate with contemporary transnational death politics. Who has the authority to return the dead? What moral, bureaucratic, and ancestral claims converge around the migrant corpse? And how do these claims expose the uneven geographies of mobility, citizenship, and kinship that structure the modern world? Thank you very much.
Thank you, George. Thank you so much. This is so fascinating, and thank you for sharing the images from your family burial grounds. That's if anything, the serenity of the scenery is fantastic. So thank you, and I'm sure everybody would have comments and questions at the end. A reminder to everyone again, keep posting those in the chat. It might help organize ourselves and the speakers in responding to those later. So I'm going to jump right in for Lionel's presentation. So our next speaker is Dr. Lionel Obadia, who is a professor of anthropology at the University of Lyon. Sorry, Lyon.
That's a certain way to pronounce it, but that's okay.
Well, it would be
Please go
fun,
ahead.
wouldn't it? Wouldn't it? University of Lyon.
Yeah,
So
Lion.
University of Lyon and has been a visiting scholar at the University of Brussels and Oxford in the past. So Lionel is here to talk to us about digital decolonization of death. It is over to you. Are we okay with sharing the screen? We had a couple issues earlier. Is
Yeah,
this
yeah.
okay?
Actually, I cannot share the
Perfect.
screen, so that's why Stacy will be very helpful.
Excellent.
Thanks to everyone. I will be very fast. You will see that it will leave room enough, I guess, to the question. And I understand perfectly why I'm the last one in the line, because this perfectly match what have been said previously, and the issue of decolonial studies and death and something like that, and bringing back culture into the foreground of reflection is really, really important. So as an anthropologist myself, I used to be an anthropologist of religion for a long time. And since the last 7-8 years, I've been doing some field work in labs, studying artificial intelligence, robotics, and so on. And now I'm an anthropologist of, let's say, the digitization process. And it came to my mind, so just to introduce my work, it came to my mind that to a certain extent it changed the lives of the living person, but it also, technology, I mean, changed also the lives of the deceased. And I started a couple of years ago to write a book in French on the hereafter, and there are 1 or 2 chapters devoted to the new ways of coping with death and rituals and grieving in modern society. And it quickly also came to my mind that one of the main revolution was artificial intelligence revolution, and the possibility to have conversational agents and avatars online and avatars on your smartphone. Oh, okay, I have to calculate the time. Sorry. And so I'm working on the deadbots, and if I might also advertise another book that was just previous to this one, this one, Decolonizing Death Studies. I already start working on the issue of the impact of high tech on death with friends and colleagues, Vincent Costa, Jordi Valverde, and Alejandro Pinilos. And this is a competing title, but I don't mean this one is really, of course, I make the advertising for this one. So a bit of context, and I get straightforwardly to the point because it will be only a couple of slides, but just to introduce the complexity of the issue of colonial and decolonizing their studies. You see that it's into a quotation mark means that I should bring a slightly critical views on this concept. But first, the context. So we live in a changing phase of death and grief in the context of EV digitization, and there are some new ways of, let's say, cope with the dead people, dead bodies, and so on. And I take only here 4 examples, 3 examples of new funeral rites, for instance, aquamation, that you turn into water and your body is transformed into water, and all the organic elements are founded into the water, are fusion into the water. And the second one is human composting, bringing back to the nature. So Tamara, it also brings, and Tamara and George, it also brings bridges in between us and between the grief and nature, because in the West, some countries try to develop this technique of human composting, yet there is a problem of the limitation, legal limitation and cultural acceptation of such technique or ritual. And the last one is cryogenic freezing, means that cryogenic freezing was used to maintain the corpse in a state of almost living, with the hope of bringing back to life in a couple of years, of decades, of centuries. But now we are develop a cryogenic freezing technique so as to turn the body into small parts, and then after a while it is becoming dust. So all these new rituals are bringing technologies, old-fashioned technologies like composting, but new technologies, not only digital, but new technologies that are kind of revolution, cultural revolution in our relationships to death and disease. And of course, they are changing memorials. For instance, with the QR code, you can have all the elements about the people that are under the tomb and have their pedigree, CV, history, face, and so on, and all these elements. So digital revolution impacts the lives of the living and the life of the death. And please, next one. If possible. Okay. And within these technologies, I have focused just on one that seems really important to me, because this is a very recent one and very controversial. There's a lot of discussion, a lot of debates regarding the rise of the so-called deathbots. Deathbots or grief bots, there are very, very many terms to qualify it. So what's it's all about? It's an avatar that is created by the use of LLM technology, means artificial intelligence, and the possibility to collect your digital traces and then to create an avatar of you after your death. And all this started in the mid-2000s when, for instance, the @Roman initiative was an accident, and a girl that was friend with this guy named Roman, he was killed in an accident, and then she decided to create a digital avatar of the friend, and then it became a conversational agent. And then Roman was something like the first deadbot in history, but this was very isolated. In the 2000 to 2010, 2020, things were very quickly changing, and from isolated initiative, we shifted towards art initiative. For instance, in Japan, the Digital Shaman was an initiative devoted to also recreate dead persons by means of artificial intelligence, but it was broadcast, it was open, it was not only friendly way to have a memory of the deceased person. And finally, in the 2020s, we shifted toward very specific movements, specific dynamics towards the industrialization of these deadbots. Means that it all started with the September Project in the USA, and then in Korea, China, Japan, and many countries, we witnessed the development of enterprises and organizations that sell their services and prestations so as to recreate dead person, and then you can share with them, and then you can keep the memory of the deceased person within your ordinary life and the ordinary screen that they have, for instance, in your smartphone or on your computer. So it brings about a new economy of death and grieving, and many organizations now share the market. But what is interesting is that it's becoming widespread, using different systems, postmortal avatars, but after digital traces, like, for instance, again, LLM, AA conversational agents, or you can also use virtual reality that has been developed in Korea, for instance. But we create interactive agents as persons, as new way of bringing them to life, but only a digital life. What is interesting is that this is quite widespread, quite commented, yet this is also highly controversial, and in many countries, this is not allowed. Everyone talks about this, but this is not exactly developed and exactly accepted. Can we shift toward the next one, please? Okay, so then these approaches to death and grief bots rise three different types of different sectors of different domains of reflection. For instance, ethical issue. Of course, this is changing conceptions of life and death, and they are changing issues in the meaning of life. For instance, if life used to be structured after the end of life, after the meaning of death and afterlife, then it's slightly changing right now. And the status of the living and the deceased is also changing, because the deceased are not deceased, because they are still there in digital, in the digital screen and digital reality. Of course, this brings at the forefront of the agenda of reflection the will to immortality. You know, this old dream of humanity is that, okay, to bypass and to go beyond death and to succeed against the issue of death. And this is a philosophical and anthropological issue. Of course, there are issues in responsibility, because very fast it brings things up to the legal issues of who is creating these avatars. The deceased person before dying, or the parents and the family and the relatives that want to have the image of the person without the consent. And then it brings us to the last point of technological issues, is issues in data and traces, because this is a really, really important issue. For instance, you can see a table down the screen there on the right. This is the traces of the dead people online. I mean, the internet and the social network platforms are replete with these profiles of dead person, but still there are digital traces, and this is a big ethical and legal issues. Of course, psychologically speaking, there are discussions regarding the efficiencies of deadbots. Is it really a good way to get into the process of grieving? And psychologists do not agree on that, because there are huge debates, and something that to a certain extent for the very, very first days after the death of a person, then it all have a positive effect on grieving, of course, but in a long-term process, this is absolutely not the case, because it doesn't bring you to the end of the grieving process, and then there is something troubling our relationship to the ancestors, to the dead person, and so on. And then, of course, since it's an avatar and a digital avatar, it's blurring the frontiers between reality and imagination. Next one, please. As an anthropologist, then, I'm trying to bring, of course, anthropological views. And then I've been recording different case studies. And my perspective was much more focused on the coming from the digital studies and then bringing the issue of death into the digital issues. But I did try to bring back to the agenda of research the issue of diversity. So my two colleagues already mentioned this previously in their fieldwork, but same technologies bring about different meanings, different mode of appropriation, different use. And this is really important not to think global without taking the local into account, especially when it's about these technologies and the way people cope with them according to the system of representation, cultural background, on the cultural background. Of course, this brings about also the political economy of digital death, because there are many resistance against these technologies, especially in the countries where they have been framed. And this is one of the paradoxes that brings this issue really important for the decolonizing death studies. I will bring back this point in the next slide, but there is okay, this one, let's go directly. But no. France, and for instance, in France, this is strictly forbidden to use deadbots. But you know that LLM and artificial intelligence technologies have been framed, especially in Western countries, and then become widespread and appropriated by the other countries. And then there is a strange pathways of these technologies that started in the West and then spread worldwide and have been framed after, let's say, Asian style technology and Asian style also way of coping with the death. And then it brings back the technology to the West, and there are a huge resistance in Western countries against these technologies. So it brings the question of what Cécile Fontaine, who is a Canadian sociologist, and she framed the concept of post-mortal society. And this brings the question of the extension of such post-mortal society. Means that not everywhere around the world we have the same concern and we have the same inclination towards this technology. Next one, please. And this will be the last one. So then, is this the end of the Western modern way of coping with death and grieving, but also a technocultural model? Deadbots, as I told you, start in the West, continues in the East, and ends up in the West. But still, this is important that to mention that there are huge debates, huge controversies. And then the reluctance of the West to cope with the technology that has been invented in the West, but across the countries and across the cultures, raise issue about colonialism. Raquel Fernandez has keenly framed the concept of thanato-colonialism. This is really interesting because there's a certain way to impose a model against death and against coping with the bodies and so on. But my question that I raised in this chapter, and I'm still trying to think about this and write on this topic, is which model of post-mortal death is it all about? Is it a Western or Asian one? And what kind of decolonization process is into the arena? Is it a digital colonialism or this is a cultural colonialism? And then we have two different kind of logics bringing about, let's say, a complex interlace in between the different aspects of the colonial models and the decolonization of this by means of these technologies. I think this is this last point, right? Yeah, thank you. Been very fast, but I wanted to go straightforwardly to the point. Maybe it's not that clear, but I'm open to the question. Thank you.
That's excellent. Thank you so much, Lionel. And I must admit, I was quickly struck, made me think when you've mentioned, because the deceased is not deceased because they're online. Like the reconception of even the language we use when we think of these matters through the different technological advancements. Okay, well, enough of my comment. Thank you to all three. This has been fantastic. I'm sure there are comments and questions. I can see that already a couple of people have been posting in the chat. Before I open it up, I would like to announce the winner of the raffle, actually, that did take place in the background. And we do have, and apologies, I'm only going by the name that is in the list of attendees here. So we have Yaha, is that correct? Am I pronouncing it correct?
Jaha, thank you very much.
Jaha, you will be receiving a copy of the book, and thank you for being here today. I will privately in the Zoom send you a message so that we can exchange emails, so I can find out where we need to make sure it is sent. Okay. Okay, fantastic. So open to the floor is yours. So questions, comments, contestations, I guess. And we can start perhaps with those that have been posted already in the chat. I don't know, Stacey, if you kept track of those.
So I believe the first one was a question for Tamara. Francis Weller believes that earth grief is not a grief that can be resolved because things are unfolding and only getting worse. How do you think that it can be resolved? So and perhaps George might want to chip in on that as well, but we can start with Tamara and see if other panelists want to speak to that too.
Stacey, and thank you, Elizabeth, for such a wonderful question. I think that what we wanted to do in our chapter, but in our work in general, is point that ecological grief is not to be resolved if we consider resolutions as we tend to consider them in the West. One thing that we wanted to make clear is that ecological grief is not a personal experience as such. and hence it cannot be resolved within the individual. It doesn't move through the cycles of grief as we know them in the West. It's a relational, cultural, political, embodied, spiritual experience that so many people and so many cultures around the world have been grappling with for such a long time. And in some way, in the Western world, we are sort of catching up on what indigenous peoples around the world have been saying to us for centuries now, at least until industrialization and more speedy colonization, that the way that we're extracting the resources from Earth is not sustainable. And so I think our team is very much on the same page with Francis Weller in that we don't advocate for seeking quick resolutions. But at the same time, none of the participants in our study, and neither do we want to take a very, pessimistic, dystopian worldview. So what we wanted to point to in our conclusion is that maybe this grief, ecological grief, climate grief, is an invitation for reconsidering how can we ethically live with each other and other animal and plant species. And so I think we're on the same page, very much so. I don't know, George, if you wanted to add something to this.
Thank you, Tamara. First of all, I agree with you that it can't be resolved. But one thing there is that it's very, very painful and it's real. You saw my village in 1980s. And more recently, I returned to Uganda and I found everything has changed. There is tarmac roads, buildings, people are buying skyscrapers. I mean, they're building. There is one thing they were celebrating is that there is electricity everywhere. And for me, I was like, oh, so there is a gap in understanding what eco-grief is, where the urban setting do not seem to get it the way the rural setting get it. So the return of me was the urban me going back to the village. But the living, when I left Uganda coming to the UK and to Kampala city, it was the rural me. So within inside me, I was like, how do I understand this? So resolving this would be, first of all, decolonizing the way we understand it. And the next thing is conversations like this. But how are we going to reach the people who are being affected innocently, those who have not left, but they have seen the change being taken to them? And how are we understanding it when we are this way? So the resolution is in striking that understanding.
If I might continue that across, sorry, Panagiotis, I don't want to take over, but I really was struck by the concrete in your village and the concrete on the graves and kind of what Lionel was saying, so connecting across to the third speaker about kind of materials and the kind of qualities of them, what they mean in different places, the kind of relationality of these kind of materials, because in a Western perspective, had a very different perspective of concrete like 20, 30, 40, well, let's say 50, 60 years ago. And then obviously seeing the concrete there makes us feel like, oh God, but in the local context, that might be a very different perception of that material. And I think that's what Lionel was pointing to as well with the kind of Asian view of the development of technology and our kind of Western approach in Silicon Valley, that very locational approach to development. And then the Russian example with Roman. So this kind of distributed development of technology and the symbolic meaning of those things. So perhaps pass that to George and Lionel. And then if anyone else has other questions in the background, please put them in the chat. Please put your hand up virtually, obviously, and we'll get to you as well. Sorry, thanks.
Yeah, just to jump briefly into the discussion and then follow up on Tamara and George perspective. I'm just trying to bring the other aspects of ecology, means the digital ecosystem now. So it's adding to the existing ones, and it makes a really complex environment made of digital devices and real stuff on the other one, and tradition and modernity. All things are mixed together in very complex, let's say, a new system, hybrid system, and this is what that makes it really exciting to study this stuff. Nothing to add.
Thank you, Lionel. And there's one more question in the chat by Nazir Ahmed to you. So the question is, how does your study benefit the marginalized nations in the digital world?
Okay, Nazir, not directly. When Stacy mentioned or underscored the issue of Asian style and Western style, I didn't take time enough. I didn't save time to discuss these points because, of course, these are essentialization of the Asian model on the one side and the Western model on the other side, since this is in globalization process much more complex than this. Of course. This is, as I told you at the very end of the last slide, there is an issue regarding, okay, on the one side, the digital colonialism means that, this is, let's say, a playground for digital ecosystem, a playground for different forces, for different conflicts and different tensions in between people, nations, societies, enterprises, and so on. And this is not as simple as exist nations on the one side and they fight on the digital world, or they try to have alliance on the digital world, and it brings back the thing on the real world. But what I try to underscore is that the logics of being there in the digital world, having a digital life, digital almost societies online, is not exactly a line of the classical model of sociology. We don't make a society the same way in real life and in the digital world. And especially since now this is much more hybridized in between the two. And so the marginal nations first have to cope with the access to these technologies and the will to reach this level of technology before jumping into the discussion. Of course, this is quite clear that deadbots and griefbots are first and foremost very specific technology for very rich, wealthy countries where this technology have the chance to develop, but not everywhere around the world. So this is not a universal process.
Thank you. That's very useful. And perhaps there's more to it in terms of what we mean by technology in the context. Hilary, please do come in. And I hope everybody's okay with first name basis.
Yes, I am. Yes, thank you. First of all, I just want to thank you for these webinars because they're so interesting, and thank you to all of the speakers for sharing your work. It's absolutely fascinating. My question was first and foremost to Lionel, but also welcome the other speakers to come in as well if you feel you have a response. I'm really interested in how the digital landscape has been changing grieving practices globally. I mean, I'm based in the UK, even in the West here, where we don't experience deathbots, but we do grieve and memorialize online. And I'm really curious. My research is around suicide, and that's a very stigmatized death. So I'm just curious if you've got any thoughts on how this very public and open trend in grieving intersects with ideas around acceptability of different kinds of deaths.
Okay, this is a pretty good question. Actually, all the cases I've been studying and all the cases available, you have information on the who and when and maybe to a certain extent why. These are accidental or natural death, but not suicide. And this is exactly a very good point. I didn't take it into account. And thank you, Hilary. This is really interesting. Since suicide is also raising issue of morality, ethics, and you don't have to do that according to different belief system and so on. And I didn't think about the way that suicide comes into sight for the deadbot studies. So thank you. I don't have any clear response to that, but I don't have a case that should illustrate the way a suicide has come to a deadbot device. So I will bring back I will get back to my sources and I let you know when I have something, if I have something.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good, great. And
Can I
perhaps
jump in quickly? I have a few things to say.
yes,
if we have
please do,
time.
Tamara. Go ahead.
Thank you, Hilary, for a wonderful question. So it's maybe not related to the presentation I gave tonight, but in our larger study that I mentioned, in interviewing about 100-something people who were grieving or working in the grief space, we interviewed a lot of people who were grieving losses by suicide or who worked in the space of supporting. And we definitely noticed the labor, emotional and digital labor, that people who've mourned losses due death by suicide have had to invest. And actually last week we just released a paper was published in Social Media and Society on unshareability of some of these forms of death and loss. And so while what we see on social media or on media in general is digital mourning, public eulogies, sharing memorializations, but we don't see it when it comes to some of these more, let's say, stigmatized forms of death. And death by suicide is one of them, not the only one. But so when there are certain complications, we wrote about the work that people need to put into managing their digital presence in terms of connecting, disconnecting, managing holidays, managing personal important days, but also the work that platforms do in terms of that it's nearly impossible to post anything about suicide on social media, right? Like the platforms would eliminate that. And what it does to this skewed picture of grief and loss and that we see on social media, where it's all, in a way sterilized as much as that can be sterilized. Like it's always quite messy. But yeah, thank you for that question. It's a really important.
Thank you for your response. It's really interesting. I'd be really grateful if you could share the link to that paper. Oh, has somebody just done that?
I think my colleague Larissa has just posted something.
That's great. I really look forward to reading that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent.
I'll also chip in a bit.
Yeah, George, go ahead.
Thank you, Hilary. That's a very important question. I'm on a platform of a certain social group from Uganda, and recently someone took his own life in London, and I think a non-family member posted a picture of this young man with his parents when he was still young, but this time he died when he was, I think, 25. But the response was that people were really rough. They went to ask this person, what right did she have to post this and that? And was the grief her own? And so on. So what African societies are doing in such cases is death is not sort of kept aside. They'll put it the way it is. But when it comes to suicide, you don't see the cause of death. They simply keep quiet. And if the body is going to be returned to the country of origin, they will make sure the cause is hidden. So that's how suicide cases and grief are held against or within, the social media platforms and modern technology.
Thank Thank you, George. It's really interesting.
Thank you, everyone. Much appreciated. Stacey, do you have a question or a comment?
It's not a question, it's just bringing something else into the room because I thought it was useful that so recently in the UK we've had this documentary launch, Molly versus the Machines. I don't know if people have seen it or have seen its existence. So this is the documentary about Molly Russell, who died by suicide around 8 years ago. And they finished the inquest, I think, close to 3 or 4 years ago. And it was officially decided in the inquest that she was killed, that she died partially due to social media. So social media, and particularly Instagram, was considered as the part of the cause of death. And that was due to the fact, because it was really interesting what Tamara was saying about that they delete everything off the platforms, because this was kind of saying the opposite, that they actually don't delete the harmful data. And they had their safety person from Meta standing there in the inquest because they recreated the whole inquest in this documentary. So if you haven't seen it, I would really recommend it. Someone's put it in the chat. Brilliant. It's just come out. It's just launched. So it's like a week and a half, 2 weeks old kind of thing. But essentially, they had the safety officer from Meta there basically saying, well, no, we need to keep this content online because it helps people to see it. And like it somehow, so she was bringing in this argument, but she said there were no academics that would support her in this statement. So there was a really interesting tension between kind of what the academic community was saying, people stepping down from the board of academics that Meta had in line with this safety around children. And in the UK, the development of the UK Online Safety Act, particularly being something that's been brought forward through the advocacy of Molly Russell's father, who is a key part of this documentary about Molly, but actually more about kind of online safety and around the platforms and around the way that Instagram and Facebook and these platforms function in relation to young people. Sorry, I just thought that would be useful to bring into the room in this conversation.
No, thank you, Stacey. Thank you very much. And I'm afraid because of time, I will have to take the last few minutes to help us summarize a little bit from today, because I also want to acknowledge a couple more things before we conclude today. But by no means this is not the end of a conversation. I would highly recommend and encourage people, and somebody already put it in the chat, to connect with one another and kind of keep the discourse alive. And I think for me anyways, that's one of the parts of the beauty of being in this field, and within the knowledge production, knowledge sharing. And I think it's all about that. Um, First of all, just a concluding note from me and a comment about our presentations today as well. And I think it almost and this is how my brain works, I guess, a little bit, is as I'm going through my notes from when our speakers were talking, Tamara, George, and Lionel. I was thinking, well, there's a common, a question that runs through here for me across the three, which is, where does grief live? What is the address of grief if grief lived somewhere? Because we're talking about the land and the environment, and we're talking about the repatriation of bodies and remains and artifacts and memories. And we're also talking about the disconnect from the physical location, so the complete movement on a transhumanistic level. So quite an incredible thing, and maybe the three of you can write something about the new address of grief. So thank you everyone for being here. I want to acknowledge two people that we have not mentioned, and I think it's really important to do that. The first one is the artist that has so generously allowed us to use one of his photographs. I'm going to have to unblur my background, I think, to be able to, for those of you that have not seen it. How do I do this? Oh, there you go. You should be able to see me. To use this image for the cover of the book, and I don't know how many of you know what this is, but this is an image of, and maybe Stacey, could you put the image in the chat perhaps? This is the image of the stone garden in Iran. And I've got a couple of notes, and I want to acknowledge this fully. So the artist's name is Farshid Rahimi Kalahrudi. This is an Iranian photographer that has worked for many years around imageries and depicting kind of the themes of mortality through different contexts and a lot of marginalized lands and voices that have been captured through that. And what I showed, so the Farsi in Farsi, the stone garden is known as the Sanji. I think it's pronounced Sanji. And that is a garden that was created by somebody called Darvish Khan. There is a blurb that explains the story behind it in the book. And this was Darvish Khan was a deaf-mute farmer from the Kara Sadlu tribe, and they lost their land during the 60s because there was a land reformation in Iran at the time. But the grief they experienced and the grief they went through from that big loss had them go back to this land and continuously start hanging stones from the dead branches of his own trees from that land. And this is what you see in the image. It's the dead trees with the stones hanging. And that has, over the years, not to, overkill it, I guess, become a heritage site. And what you see in the image on the book cover is, in fact, the very grave of Dervish Khan, who was buried there finally. It's a very powerful image. The story it has is very powerful, and it really, in a picture, it really told the story of the whole book for us. It was just really exactly what the thesis of the book was, what everybody was talking about in this book. So thank you to the wonderful artist, Rashid Rahimi Kalahrudi. The other person I want to acknowledge is the wonderful Professor Just Fontaine, who's based in South Africa, Johannesburg, has done so much ethnographic work in Zimbabwe and Kenya as well. And he has so kindly, he's an anthropologist and has so kindly written a foreword for this book, which we're very much indebted to him for that and the acknowledgements he gave to the need for us to be having this discourse. I think that's all from me. I will leave in the chat a couple of things. One is, and I want to acknowledge this because it is about the thesis of this book, so the decolonization of these discourses and grief and death. And I want to recognize a colleague and a friend, Cami Fletcher, that some of you may know, who's running the collective for radical death studies in the US. And I will put in the chat a bit of information because the collective of radical death studies is seeking for more people to get on its board and help with these discussions. So I will put it in the chat. Those of you interested, please jump on it. And maybe we can put in the chat as a reminder, another space that I think it's become a wonderful platform for so many voices to be able to talk in death studies, which is the Death Studies podcast. And some of the contributors of this book have already been on that podcast and have had discussions about their work, which I think is wonderful. And so maybe we would invite you to explore that as well, more generally, because I think it becomes a good inclusive platform, albeit in English. And I think, that's one of the limitations we have to recognize, that we talk about all of this, but we do it all in English. I'm sure accumulatively in this room, we speak about 20 different languages, but really, here we are again doing this in English. So we got to acknowledge that limitation. So a massive thank you from me. I would like to invite Stacey in if she would like to say anything final, and then we will close this.
Yeah, I'd just love to say thank you to everybody in the room and thank you to all the authors. It's been such a great journey working with all of you. And you have really incredible directional thinking and kind of leading thinking on this. So, I really love to continue conversations together and keep working together in different ways.
Any final thoughts from our speakers before we disappear?
Before we disappear, but there's a really good joke. Congratulations. That's it. Thanks a lot. It was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.